oftentimes when you're on social media, they are portraying their daily lives as opposed to portraying the ways in which they interact with this particular sport. In the comparative, what actually exists on our side is two things. Firstly, given the mainstream media has an incentive, what this means is that journalists oftentimes are talking about players and the ways in which these particular players interact with the association. So, for example, how players have been evolving, how players are becoming much, much better. What that particularly means that they are focusing on things that media coverage is supposed to be tackling, i.e., the ways in which these particular sports can be much, much better. On their side, social media and the fact that they have to compete with other individuals, be able to have so much fans, etc., etc., means, for example, they're going to be most likely going to be focusing on other things as opposed to the sports, for example, their daily lives, etc., etc. But the second thing about the social media rhetoric, right, is that given that it's going to be focused on things like free online streaming, what that particularly means is that oftentimes the ways in which in the status quo TV rights deals are structured is that they are structured to be able to cater for all the teams within this particular sporting association. So for the NBA, every single team has the ability or has like a specific amount of time in which coverage will be like centered around them. What this does is that given that the rise in social media means that you're going to be decentralizing the coverage of this particular news media. What it therefore means is that most of these particular sponsors will then decide to pick and choose the kinds of teams and the kinds of associations that they would want to stream freely. What that particularly means that less popular games or less popular teams are less likely to be able to have coverage around their own plays, coverage around team player like relationships, or coverage around like the kinds of like the games that they're going to be playing, right? What's the impact of this is twofold. Firstly, it means that you have less coverage around much more important parts of the sport. So, for example, the iconography around someone like Cristiano Ronaldo means that more likely a lot of students, so more likely a lot of viewers are going to be focused on his daily life as opposed to how he interacts with like a team like Manchester United. The problem with this is that on our side, you have much more increased interaction, given that the viewers will be able to actually see the ways in which these particular players are playing, because the mainstream media has an incentive to want to focus more importantly on things like stats as opposed to like the daily lives of these particular players. Before I move on to the second impact, I'll take a point from closing.
So why is traditional media going to have a minimum level of coverage for all teams? Why don't they just only show the popular ones if that's what people want to see?
Yeah, like they show every single team because the mainstream media has an incentive to want to popularize these particular associations. But in a situation where you decentralize the ability of the mainstream media to cover every single team, it means that the incentive therefore becomes like much more profit opinionated, and it means that the individuals that are sponsoring these particular associations would then decide to pick and choose the kinds of things that they are sponsoring or the kinds of things that they'll be covering. The second impact here is that we make the sports less competitive due to the fact that most of these particular players are less likely going to be talking about much more controversial issues around this particular sport. So, for example, it's unlikely that someone like Cristiano Ronaldo will be talking about things like player leases, player contracts, etc., etc. It therefore means that you are less likely to have viewers interacting with the sports in ways that they will be able to make that particular sports better. This is true because the ability of sporting fans to be able to put pressures on these particular associations is the only way in which, in the vast majority of instances, you're able to create change in a meaningful way. What that means is that by decentralizing these particular sporting associations and the coverage around this, they're less likely going to be talking about controversial issues that will therefore lead to more participation from the viewers, right? The second thing I also want to point out is that in terms of media coverage, right, on our side, the media coverage is much more organized system of coverage. What that means is that it's much more easier for sponsors to be able to understand the things that it's more likely to be profitable, it's more likely to have a large majority of fans listening to. So, for example, within sporting associations, right, these particular media coverage has like statistics around the kinds of shows, the kinds of time that people spend on these particular shows. What that means that it's more likely that you'll be able to use that piece of information to characterize that particular sport in ways in which these particular fans will therefore have an incentive to want to interact. On their side, given that it is less organized, most of these particular things are going to be lost. You're less likely going to be able to incentivize sponsors to be able to invest within these particular sports because they don't necessarily know what is much more likely to have fans engaging with. On our side, we are a much more organized system. On our side, we allow for much more inclusivity and much more participation and focus on what is most important for these particular sports. And for that reason, we are more likely to have these particular sports being much more sustainable. For all of those reasons, vote open opposition.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. And with this, I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here, here.
Hey, can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. there are 4 problems that plague traditional media. The first is that traditional media is heavily formalized. It means that you have no way of making it in the world unless you have the connection with the specific journalist or with the specific team, association, PR rep who handles these kind of things. And that stops the ability of many people from engaging this space and only privileges those who already have the connections, already have the money to be able to make it on the very limited screen time of a TV station. The second thing is that traditional media is quite risk averse. And what we see in the current trends of sport is that sports, when it's moved to social media, has been relatively diverse in their revenue raising strategies. For example, they've opened up the gambling market a lot more. You can gamble from your phone, for example. The way that they tell narratives, the way that they have like videos explaining players' like lives and the documentaries have vastly expanded. And this is never done with traditional media because it is far too much risk to use up your traditional TV platform to take a risk when you can take these risks on a sport team's social media channel. The third thing is that everything becomes strongly filtered because the nature of traditional media is that they have editors. They want to make sure everything is perfect. And no opening opposition explains that you want those things to be perfect. Our explanation is that you don't want those things always to be tip-top perfect because you want a closer engagement between the fans and the players. And that doesn't happen when everything has been wiped over with an editor or a translator. And the fourth thing is, and this is the gutting thing about traditional media, is that the revenue model of traditional media is entirely based on exclusivity, which is to say that if you have a cricket game, for example, and the revenue model of Fox Media is to have a TV subscription, in which case, like, you know, people pay for that TV content, that means that that cricket association cannot contract its sponsorship rights out to any other organization or stream it anywhere else or demonstrate that sport in any other area because they have that exclusivity contract with that traditional media platform. That is distinct to, for example, when you have a contract with a Twitch stream or a Vimeo stream or something like that, or you have general social media coverage, which is more based on the revenue, not from like pay TV, but from things like ads and sponsorships and all that kind of stuff, which are not exclusives, which means that you can attract a far greater degree of sponsorship and you can be far more broad in the way that you operate like that. Let's look at the story of a poor Brazilian soccer team, right? That Brazilian soccer team right now, well, not right now, in the past, under traditional media, their only choice was to contract themselves out to the local Brazilian TV station. What that meant was that the pool of money they could get was very small, but it also meant that McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Samsung, Apple could never really sponsor that Brazilian team because they knew that that TV station only played to the Brazilian local audience. But that was an inefficient model because obviously, as we know, Brazilians are great at soccer and millions of fans around the world in Europe, in Asia would love to watch Brazilian sports. Outside is the one that activates and weaponizes that because we allow them to reach the world. It means that when they can get a broader stream that people all around the world can watch, it means that McDonald's is more likely to sponsor that because McDonald's as a global rich corporation knows that they can reach fans everywhere and not just the Brazilian fans in villages that don't even have a McDonald's. And that is why we win this debate. 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, about play treatment. Secondly, about the growth of sport. And thirdly, about free speech. Firstly, about play speech treatment. Their main strategy here is just to say that we're lying and say like, well, you know, traditional media does a really good job of covering different plays and covering their stories and all that kind of stuff. The first thing to say is that we're not supporting a new model. We're supporting stuff that is already happening now. This transition has already happened to a large degree under the status quo. And that is why the mainstream media has adapted itself in a way to compete with social media. The mainstream media has recognize that because of the transition to social media, and social media has been good in having individualistic coverage of players, media has thus transitioned in that aspect. So that is a benefit for our side, not something that you already claim on your side. The second thing to say is that there is a limit to the media coverage that you can get. Because maybe, yeah, like for the NBA, every player is famous. So, you know, they could do a long form piece on every single player. But how about women's basketball, right? They'll just never cover women's basketball because it is not in their incentive to do that when the following is smaller. But when women's basketball can proactively advertise on social media and attach to a niche of fans who really woke and really care about women's basketball, at least they can monetize that audience. On their side, they can't monetize anything because they can't get that contract. The second thing they say is, well, this is really bad because it means that players just spend a lot of the time portraying their own lives as opposed to like talking about the sport, which is presumably what mainstream media does. This is not a harm. It is a good thing if you can get social media engagement on not just game day, right? When you get engagement on the players' lives, their training, on their interviews, the way that they talk to other people. And that's really important because the reason why I and many sport fans around the world watch sport isn't just to watch a basketball go into hoops. Like, it's not the mechanical action of sport. It's the fact that there are narratives and stories involved in it. There's trash talk involved in it, that we care about the people's lives, that someone came from a developing country and never had coaching but became a great soccer player. That's the kind of thing that people are into. And that's the kind of thing they lose when they cover it all up with traditional mainstream media that doesn't care about all these players' stories and only want to, you know, wipe a nice paintbrush over it. Let's definitely talk about the growth of sport. The main claim here is that there is an oversaturation of coverage on social media, and that makes it hard for small, you know, sports stars and all that to stand out. The first problem is that all of these arguments are entirely uncomparative because obviously mainstream media only has incentives to focus on big names and big teams. The second thing to say is that even if there was like reduced access on either side, our side at least is a lower barrier to entry for these small developing teams because running a social media campaign is far easier than getting an exclusive TV contract. And the third thing to say is that at least you can always like promote yourself and surgically target the kind of fan clubs that you care about. For example, a women's team can target like through advertising analytics on social media, very specific audiences and monetize them. And they can't do that from mainstream media. Closing, do you have a point of information?
The one who win on the social media or fame war are those who win connection to top teams and managers such as Sentinels or Team Liquid.
That was a bit unclear. Can you explain that in half the time?
The one who won the fame on social media are the one with connection to high-profile team such as Sentinels or Team
people with connections benefit on either side. You're never going to change that. The difference is on our side, it is easier for a poor person to weaponize a social media campaign and reach everyone because that content is fantastic, as opposed to on your side when that rich person has the direct connection with the one TV station in the area, right? All right, let's lastly talk about speech. They say that players might stir up controversy by having social media accounts. The first thing to say is that all this controversy like sexual harassment and stuff still happens. It just gets covered up by the pretty media. We'd rather those things to be exposed. Like if players are being treated badly, we'd rather than calling those teams out on social media. The second thing to say is that if this controversy is just random, then it's good controversy gets engagement. And lastly, explain free speech is important in a lot of instances for minorities, for people speaking about like the Chinese government censoring sports, about the Saudi government sponsoring certain sports. That kind of speech is valuable. That is not a kind of speech that we want to lose. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. Before I call the next speaker, please be careful when you take the POIs, so it's not after the 6th minute. And with this, I would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close up the top half. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Please give me a second to set my timer. I'm using my partner's device, so I'm just going to leave from the other phone so I don't have feedback. Okay. Panel, a couple of things we get from OG in this debate is largely on comparative because it does not actually look at the status quo and gives a characterization to sports and its partnership with traditional media. That is not true. So my partner has already explained to you that in most instances, when these partnerships are being made, these particular media houses end up involving smaller teams. This is because in most instances, you can't end up buying TV rights in isolation. You need to buy TV rights in a way that covers all other teams, because at the end of the day, these teams are all teams in the league. And insofar as you are being like you are going to cover the league as a TV station or a sports media house, you would have to be able to purchase the particular like TV rights license that would involve all of these individuals. Because, for example, even if a small team exists, you will still have to pay them for TV rights because these small teams would end up interacting with big clubs, etc. So at the end of the day, like there's a huge incentive. But recognize that these particular things happen through their unions and associations. So the unionization and association means that in most instances, small clubs are not left alone. In Ops world, small clubs are going to suffer because the amount of coverage you are able to get at a small club depends largely on things like the number of followers you have and the number of hardcore fans that are going to come to your social media platform and even check out your tweets, etc., or even watch these particular things on the streaming platforms that you talk about. At the end of the day, these particular smaller clubs may die out or may not just get coverage, which means that the monopoly that has started in most sporting like disciplines would continue to exist. So example is the European Super League that had this idea that for smaller teams that don't get enough views, we are just going to kick them out and create a league that just focuses on the big clubs. That is the kind of world you get in government's world, because at the end of the day, these particular small clubs are going to get shortchanged and are not going to get any form of help, insofar as they don't have the followers, insofar as they are not being like pulled along by the other big clubs, which is something that does not happen in their world, because all of these clubs will then have to focus on doing the coverage themselves. Or even if the associations do it, it is just not good enough, because these associations cannot leverage on things that traditional media provides, like an existing viewership base and like a huge pool of sponsors, right? I'm going to respond to a lot of argumentation on sponsorships, etc. shortly. But then we need to recognize that at the end of the debate, the biggest group of people in this debate in terms of viewership are the casual fans, because recognize that hardcore fans would come and watch these particular sporting games regardless of whether or not it is happening on social media or whether it is happening on traditional media, because there are people that are tied to these clubs, their identities, their happiness, and they are card-holding members of these clubs. So they are going to come anyway. But casual fans are extremely important, because these are the people that we would need in order to increase our viewership base, increase our metrics, to get things like sponsorship and revenue. At the end of the day, casual fans are less likely to end up encountering these sporting games insofar as we are using social media platforms for so many like structural reasons, right? So one, the nature of social media in itself is such that the algorithms create an echo chamber for you. So if all I do on social media is to engage with movie news or music related content, the likelihood that I would even encounter any form of like content that has to do with a particular sport is really, really low. And this is really problematic for sports that are not extremely popular, because at the end of the day, these sports will probably never show up on my feed. So what happens is that I'm going to stay in my echo chamber, continue to like end up engaging with my movie and music news, and not end up engaging the sports in any way whatsoever. In our world, what happens is that these particular TV stations and traditional media houses spend a lot of money on like pushing these particular things through other programming. So for example, you go to BBC for news, and BBC Sports like shows you, oh, these are the things that we have coming up in a couple of days. These are the kind of things that we'll be able to show you in terms of sports in the coming days. These are all things that do not exist in their world, and casual fans don't end up coming in, which means that we are not getting that increase in viewership. We are not getting that increase in revenue, which then means that these particular sports become stale. I'll take a POI from OG. CG.
No, traditional media skews towards popular sports such as NBA or football, but less popular sports like women's netball or swimming get absolutely no attention. Is it easier when you can choose between many different sports online, or if you're restricted to a TV which is restricted to a particular block in time?
So this comparative is not true. It is just simply not true. Most of these media houses that actually focus on sports have several TV stations showing several sporting events at the same time. Sky Sports has about 4 TV stations. Super Sports has over 4 TV stations. BBC covers sports on BBC One, covers sports on BBC 4, etc. Like, that is not just true. But even if that is the case, right, in your world, you don't explain how just the mere existence of women's netball on social media ensures that women's netball would actually end up getting any like kind of coverage that is new. I've already explained to you that women's netball will not break into the algorithm of other people's like social media feed, etc., because you just don't explain the mechanism in which this particular thing happens. I don't think you actually win on that particular clash. It is largely uncomparative. It is largely false. There's a huge assumption that just being on social media alone is going to mean that you're going to get a lot of coverage. Recognize that at the end of the day, only big names are going to end up becoming the people that benefit from this, because at the end of the day, you recognize that these particular big names are the names that have like huge following, etc. Recognize that in most instances, these people that actually end up becoming stars and become the people that attract sponsorship, etc., are people that are built by traditional media to pull the revenue into these particular places. What happens in your world is that there's a very huge possibility that we don't create a lot of stars in your world, because at the end of the day, traditional media would not be pushing these particular people in the faces of other people, which then means that these particular sports would actually struggle, right? But also recognize that beyond game day, beyond the day the game happens, they say that, if these particular superstars just talk about themselves, it is fine because then we are engaging with them beyond game day. That is false, because in your world, we are not focusing on the sports, we are focusing on these individuals and their lives. In our world, these things exist through press releases, weekly TV shows that are built around these particular sports. In our world, we actually focus on the sports beyond game day, and it is not just Cristiano Ronaldo telling us about his family, which is not particularly good for the sports, or like does not benefit the sports in any specific way. But recognize, right, at the end of the day, they argue that there are better revenue streams through gambling. Gambling is not exclusive to your world. That is not something that you can claim for your side. But secondly, at the end of the day, you can't also argue that you end up getting some new revenue streams, because the difference between you and a YouTuber is very, very minimal. At the end of the day, you are all relying on these third-party media houses and social media houses to distribute revenue to you based on the viewership that you get. What that means is that in instances where people are not watching, you get no revenue. With TV licenses, you get money at all costs because you've already sold out these particular TV licenses to these particular media houses. At the end of the day, open opposition wins this debate.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. And with this, I would like to welcome the member of government to open up the closing half. Here.
Hi y'all. Today, sorry. PY is in the chat. I'll take OO at 5:30. Am I audible?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Three, two, one. When Tanae and I first got to Motion, we were thinking quite similarly as opening government, which is to just list a comparative reasons why media coverage is generally better than traditional journalism. But the reason why this case doesn't work in this motion is that the motion requires a trade-off, as you can generically support something without trading it off. And the framing that this is important is because usually there is very little trade-off between traditional and social media. The intention you have is not limited, and you're able to do all the things to share. You oftentimes have an incentive to do both, and functionally do. And players can broadcast themselves on social media without trading off with traditional media. This framing also answers the OO push, because if social media do not cover the less popular sport, you can just watch the mainstream media. You can also watch both the game day and the lives of the athletes on both platforms. I don't see where the trade-off happens. And OG cannot just answer the symmetry push CEO pointed out in the POI by just saying that there's more happening on their side. Because what precisely is more? How the fuck do you scale it? Because I think this debate is just more than exclusive contracts. Closing government will answer a very delicate question of where this trade-off happens, and based on extension of that. I think there are two ways this trade-off is relevant. Firstly, where traditional media has a market failure in not adjusting to market demands, and two, talking about when competition makes traditional media better by just having the presence of these social media. Firstly, on market failure, the thesis of this argument is I think there exist certain reasons on how traditional media is structured that means oftentimes when you have genuine interest in female sports, there's still very little portrayal and very shit contracts in the process. There are two ways this happens. One is a lock-in effect from long-term contracts, because it isn't about exclusive contract like OG wants to talk about, but upon long-term contracts, that is, broadcasting in La Liga, in Premier League, oftentimes work upon these sponsorship deals that are 5 years, that are 10 years down the line. This is because corporations want stability and they want exclusive contracts. But there's things and updates and preferences. That is, women's football 5 years ago was way, way less popular than women's football now. But second, I think there are greater biases. That is, 80% of workers and journalists at Sky Sports are men. So even if there's a market incentive for people to want to watch women's sports, they optically feel as if that these sports are less competitive. They give less space time to it. Now this trade-off arise, because these are the ones that traditional media do not portray or portray very little that gets solved on our side. How do we solve this? One, I just think social media has a way quicker update preferences system. That is, you're not locked in by these contracts, but rather I can open my phone and I can choose to broadcast certain games in general. But two, you now have an incentive to compete against these mainstream media. It means that you're more likely to portray these sports in order to access the greater market demand that individuals have. And individuals do have market demand to watch female football, right? Because I think one, these games are quite genuinely interesting in the process, to the extent that we see Champions League driving huge amount of attention from individuals, but very little broadcasting online. But two, I think oftentimes these are just neglected market demand of the part 50% of the world that I think are genuinely interested in sports, of sport infrastructures that existed in America for the last 50 years and made more women play soccer. I think have genuine market demands that are not solved in the status quo. The end part of this is that even if when there's actual market demand for female soccer, they do not have access to solving that market demand and to broadcast on our side. This is important because one, attention is key to the development of these sports, the ability for them to negotiate contracts in the future, the ability for them to, broadcast advertising or contingent upon this. But two, the reason why our case is just more than a delay because it changes the original bargaining point, right? Because now after your contract expires, when you have more attention from social media, you're able to negotiate for a better broadcasting journal. The way it gets top up is the most tangible impact of teams that are traditionally ignored of a clear path of victory. But two, I want to talk about how does this trade-off in attention makes traditional media better. Because listen, I think there's specific things that traditional media do that these media cannot. One, accountability and specific broadcasting of investigative journals and stories that these social media just don't have an incentive to do. But two, of targeted audience of older individuals that matters as much that I think can benefit from this traditional media as being better. And I think the vast majority of people, despite us being young, do fall into this category because the average age in this world is 45. But thirdly, of TV sponsorship. And this is really important because the reason why teams are willing to accept these exclusive broadcasting contracts is because they just cannot find fucking McDonald's to sponsor them as DPM listed. That is, the opening government tells you that we can just stream on Twitch. They never recognize why streaming on Twitch is going to lead to sufficient revenue for these teams to function. On our side, if we're able to make traditional media better, all of these teams that are contingent upon traditional media, which is the vast majority of teams, gets better, and we flip the opening impact. Now, how do we make traditional media better? I think the very notion is competition. One, it forces them to adjust to new market demands in the counterfactual they can just choose to ignore because people now watch these things upon their feed and are more incentive to watch them and demand content for traditional media. But two, adjusted traditional media can drive out the unadjusted traditional media. That's why we see that sports like Sky Sports are abandoning part of their campaign and part of their newspaper and switch to go for Instagram, of hiring individuals to make reels, of making specific athletes to talk about these platforms. That I said, you don't want to be driven out by this new market demand. But thirdly, of just far greater negotiating power from teams to the extent that they are now able to have some level of broadcasting power in the counterfactual they do not. Before I get to the end impact, OLPOI, go.
Yeah, so I don't think that market failures are things that most of these particular associations will not be able to go around. So things like the NBA during the 2000s and how they had to pause for some time before they continued. And for example, the Russian-Ukraine war, like associations can always move around these particular market failures.
Yeah, like there exist external market failures, but the one we specifically lay out for you are solved. Now, on to the impact of the second point. Firstly, we're able to co-opt all the benefits opening opposition and opening government wants to talk about, right? Because to the extent that traditional media exists, even if you do not like it, I think the teams that best address how we make these teams better, I think is a team that has the most tangible impact. But two, I think these adjustments to new audiences really matters because I think the people that you need to change, these perception, for example, for smaller teams or for female athletes are not the younger individuals who get exposure to this information on either side of the house, but rather the older individuals who oftentimes control money, who oftentimes sponsorship do care about, now have access to this information, right? And now they're more willing to engage with this type of content because to the extent that these people probably are unwilling to just watch TikTok or Instagram reels, but they are willing to look at specific changes that these traditional media sources have made. So perhaps these are short-term context, perhaps these are including athletes, just things on traditional media. Because the problem with top half is that it's not like traditional media is stagnant and cannot change. Traditional media 50 years ago is very different from traditional media now. We see this as an improvement force that makes them to act better in a better way. Very happy to propose.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. And with this, I would like to welcome the member of opposition. Here.
Okay, test. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Gender pronouns. I don't have gender preferred pronouns. POI through chat. I will prioritize engagement cross bench to opening opposition. I will start my speech in. Oh, if my speech got cut off, just inform me through chat box. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Several important setup in closing opposition. Number 1, in closing opposition, we oppose transition of media coverage of sports to social media. It means under our side, we will stick to the status quo when the promotion and exposure of sports in general, including information of the athletes such as sport news or the game and match itself will still be aired on the television and media channel, for example, for sport or ESPN. Second, what is the comparative in government bench then? I think this is the comparative debate, which means we have burden to prove which type of platform will bring better significantly to the sport as a whole, since this is third-party debate. So government can say that the promotion of the sport can go hand in hand in both sides, because this is assuming that the platform is mutually exclusive. Because in your side, once you support this transition, the method of promoting and discuss sport in social media and internet will overflow traditional method of promotion and vice versa. So assuming in government, you can only enjoy sport from internet and in opposition only from traditional media, which one will be better? But lastly, just to prevent this debate from being messy, I don't think this debate is about accessibility for the athlete and team, like what's opening team mainly talking about. Because note that accessibility is symmetrical in both sides. Because if Gov said that in traditional media, they only want to buy contract to air famous team, this is also symmetrical in their side. Because the advertisement that got trending about the biography of the athlete, for example, that being headline in the social media, is also come from famous athlete, because people search and only talk about them. But even if, as judge, you think that accessibility is important matter, I think you need to note that promotion and media acts in spectrum. It means there is always actor that want to cater you, even if you're a small club, for example, O channel, that want to air local volley match. It proves that market segmentation exists for each sport and level of team, because traditional media also want to cater as much as viewer as possible, because they're profit oriented. So sadly, this debate is not talking about privileged versus unprivileged team or athlete. At best, which one more inclusive is deadlock. CO will enter this debate with more certain benefit by talking about how this affects our fans and why traditional media company will bring development for sports even better. Two arguments, all rebuttal will intertwine. One, why promoting sport event through traditional platform is better. What is the context that I want to talking in my speech? What is the characteristic that both platform have to make them different? I think the biggest differences is about the details and how long information that you get in both platform. Most likely in government, the type of information will be in bite-sized content or simplified content, because they offer it for free and you need to subscribe it if you need to get full content, for example, or TikTok that only allow you to upload 3 minutes video, for example. Why this is bad than in government with bite-sized content? 2 reasons. First, this is not providing the purpose of entertainment of the game, especially when the characteristic of sport game is take a long time. For example, football match takes 2 hours, meanwhile TikTok only allows you to upload 3 minutes video. You need to note that this benefit is really important, because we talk about the excitement and enjoyment that our viewers get. I don't think the people that OG want to cater about gray area is really matter, because if they said that, oh, the content is too long, they don't want to read it anyway, because if it's true, it means they are the one that don't have interest at all in the sport anyway in the very first place. They're not going to watch football game regularly and follow what's happening lately in NBA, for example, and all the complexities in sports such as transfer player, change of manager and coach and such. At best, they only watch sports once in a while, so they are not significant actor to be talked. So who is the most important actor to be talked and protect in this debate then? Are the loyal fans that willing to spend a lot of money to get high quality of match, or needs to get information about Cristiano Ronaldo in detailed manner because they're diehard fans of him? In your side of the house, when you cut the duration and complexity of sports to these fans, you will reduce significantly happiness that they get. Besides that, this is really dangerous, because they are the people that really want to invest a lot of things to support the development of the athlete, for example, as the diehard fans of Madrid. For example, I would willing to go to Europe and spend a lot of money to watch Madrid live, or this is the people that want to buy official merchandise, or even promote their favorite club to people around them, such as big loss in government when we lost this kind of fans and viewers because they pull out because they don't get fulfillment that they expected. That's why regarding catering to the most vulnerable actor that become the most promising actor to support the development of actor, CO win. But second, this is also bring relatability and prevent misconception to happen. This is directly clash and flip benefit from OG talking talking about social issue? Exactly, because sports in status quo not also talking about entertainment purpose only, but more than that, in status quo there's a lot of discussion in sport talking about minority representation, social movement issue, and etc. The delivery of this kind of issue needs to be in detailed manner. For example, we need to talking a lot of complexity about lower incomes, the reason why limited time access for minority, like minority athlete, limited mobility, limited facility, racism and language barrier that become root in the developed country, for example, as some of the reason for lower participation among some black and minority ethnic group, for example. Because we're talking about bigger and large amount of actor, we talk about sensitive issue, then the discussion about the dark side of sport, for example, I think that exactly why it needs to be in detailed manner, right? Because in order for you to raise awareness, you need to give full information, such as the root of the problem, the reason as to why structural problem exists in certain country, for example, why country impose unfair system to their athletes so they will get deep discussion. Because at best, you can get this information about sexual harassment of certain team or lobbying in sport, even in government batch, the discussion and advocacy not gonna sustainable because there is no relatability, or this is really rely on trend in social media. There is so arbitrary. That is why in advocacy of social issue we win. Before that,
we explain that traditional media has a revenue system based in exclusivity. CG say this again, but with some economic jargon. Can you engage in that trade-off specifically?
I think if you want to talking about the unfair accessibility system, I already told you that traditional media company also exist in a spectrum. It means there is also small media company that want to cater small team and small athlete anyway, and there is big traditional company that want to cater to famous and also big, big club anyway. So I don't really understand why accessibility is become the matter of the debate, because market segmentation exists. But second, why this is also not good for the development of sport event? What is the context and problem that I want to bring? I want to talk about money and how this is crucial part for the sport development. We're talking about the sponsor and the funding that in status quo sport association always need. Then why shift the promotion of sport event to social media is really bad and dangerous? It's because you will lose a big amount of sponsor from media company, because in status quo, the way and method of promotion of sport in television is by company buying the license of sport association. For example, if you want to air football game, you need to buy license from FIFA. It means that in your side of the house, you significantly reaches the amount of funding and also the license that you can get. It means this is really bad, because money is the prerequisite of all of the development that your club can get, for example, because you need to pay for your athletes, for example, you need a lot of money to promote your club in the, like media, for example, and such. That is why you will get a lot of, financial problem and reaches significantly the power of monetary that you have proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. And with this, I'd like to welcome the government whip to close up. Government have here.
Hello, POIs exclusively in the chat, please. I assume I am audible. I will. Okay, cool. 3, 2, 1. Traditional media is profit maximizing. They're trying to make as much money as possible. They have large numbers of very experienced people working on this. We will win government bench because opening government relies on traditional media actively ignoring existing consumer demands. That is to say, potential sources of revenue that they're leaving. And we will win the short diagonal because opening opposition relies on traditional media. Instead of catering to the most number of people who watch the most popular sports, will instead take losses for seemingly no reason and look at these local sports teams instead. In other words, no other team acknowledges why this profit maximization incentive doesn't lead to the impacts that they claim. We do this exclusively in our extension. I'll just deal with CO first and then I'll move on. The first thing CO says is social media is just going to push up fast content and not provide entertainment for the teams. I think Ricky's symmetry pushes addresses this quite well, because for those who consider long content, they can just access traditional media instead. It's not going away, right? But secondly, we think there's an incentive for social media not to do this. By their very own analysis if people don't like it. For the most vulnerable, loyal actors that CEO wants to talk about, there's incentive for social media to structure content for them so social media can retain loyal viewers and increase views. It's not like an inherent feature of Instagram that you can't have long videos. I know this because you could literally watch long videos on Instagram. The second thing they say is then minorities are benefited. But I think minorities are better accessed on our side. First, because there's more of a chance of sensitive information to be broadcasted by social media, right? Because traditional media right now, despite what opening opposition wanted to claim, is not going to do things like portray sexual assault cases or portray labor contract negotiations with the people who they literally have to sign exclusivity contracts with in a way that is not true on our side, because we exclusively demonstrate how the pressure of social media benefits them. Okay, let's talk then about how we should understand the comparative in this debate, and then I'm going to go team by team. Guys, it says at the expense, but that doesn't mean that traditional sports media doesn't go away entirely, right? It's still watched by many people, particularly by older viewers, because this is a trend that particularly impacting young people. And so you should consider these as coexisting sources. And specifically what Ricky tells you is that the people who continue to watch traditional media are benefited from the rise of social media, because the traditional media pressures make them improve, and the specific ways of improvement that Ricky mentions in that speech. So the world you need to defend is not one like opening government says, where you just take all the traditional media away and then all the problems disappear, but rather the world which we in fact live, right? It's a sports motion. The world in which we in fact live is one where they exist side by side, that certain things that used to be done by traditional media are now done by social medias. I'm going to go team by team then through this debate. I'm going to start with opening government. I'm going to ask which team better proves that we get more coverage of sports that were previously overlooked. I'm going to start with our extension. Ricky tells you that there are existing pressures to liberalize. Those are exogenous factors to this debate. Things, for instance, like feminism, meaning that more people paid attention to women's sports. The difference was on our side, we were able to accommodate them more quickly because you had lock-in contracts. And nice try opening government, but that was very different from exclusivity. Exclusivity gives you a monopoly over one team's coverage. But the fact that these contracts often last 5-10 years was far more relevant, because when you locked them in, it meant that, for instance, you've paid hundreds of millions of dollars to watch like American men's sport in the United States, where now because of like their past successes, women's soccer is probably far more successful. You still broadcast that men's soccer because you don't have the women's rights, or because the women's rights have been sold to some smaller channel that doesn't get as much attention, so on and so forth. So yes, eventually you have traditional media who now like covers women's soccer, but it takes 5 to 10 years. And that was a real harm for a lot of people. That meant that often like trends or, for instance, moments of victory were unable to be seized because you didn't have a chance to access women's soccer continuously, right? And the deficiency in opening government is they never explain why you don't just also like watch women's soccer when it comes up. Because if you have exclusivity over a specific deal, that says nothing about why like you can't have a mainstream broadcaster putting this on television. We fill this gap. But secondly, Ricky finds a way to solve this problem, right? Specifically with regards to like exclusivity contracts and sponsorship, because now far more competition means you don't take bad sponsors that have scandals that'll damage your image, where you didn't have any choice otherwise. Because on their side of the house, McDonald's is never going to sponsor that local Brazilian team. Now you're able to get revenue through other means. You don't have to like deviate, like go to like terrible sponsors, or in probably the absolute worst case, there's no sponsorship at all and no funding. So I think that the claim that they make is like, it's like half an argument. And we give you the other more important half, which is how the problem in traditional media is solved. Because once again, they don't get to just fiat that it disappears entirely, but rather that the specific means in this trade-off happened meant that there was market competition between traditional media and social media, and that's what corrected that problem. I'm going to go through every mechanism they give you now and explain why it's deficient. The first thing they say, and this is in a POI to DLO, is that you have set blocks of time in TV. This is partly responded to by DLO, which you have lots of channels, but it's also just very unimaginative, because traditional sports journalism didn't mean you remained on a TV set, right? You probably also could branch out onto websites, etc. Secondly, they say it's formalized and risk averse. Once again, falls to the framing I give you at the top of this whip, because a formalization is not in their interest. If it's like if it's better to reach out more actively to new athletes, if it's better to like go and like actually look at, for instance, people who've been drafted to the NFL and interview them in a way that doesn't require them to have some like well-connected agent, then why do they not do it in the status quo? That's a big question you should be asking every time opening government opens their mouths. Third, they tell you can't use stuff that promotes athletes' images because you want to promote kind of like the executives of the sports league. But the executives of the sports league surely make profit when their athlete stories are being publicized. No idea why like Mark Cuban wants attention when they can get more money through having attention for their own fans. Once again, very counterintuitive. And then a prime minister, they just list 8 things, which are really just like social media has features that mean that you attract more viewership, which doesn't seem to prove that you get more viewership for like women's soccer or for the specific kinds of minority sports that we wanted to talk about, but rather that you just got some like more viewership simpliciter, which once again seems symmetric because they can access that benefit on their on opposition as well. I'll take a POI from opening opposition if they have something.
So
No, I'm
recognize
going
that
to
at
move
the end
on.
of
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, the transition that happens means that things like fake news, things like bad like news coverage, etc., that happens on social media would all affect sports. In our world, we have certified journalists who at least know what they are doing.
Yeah, no, because these certified journalists also just like do really bad bias and shit, right? If you like watched sports coverage over the last 10 years, right? So let me like think about the, let me just weigh this against opening government, right? Instead of making the unrealistic claim that we solve this problem by removing it entirely, we are first able to impact a much larger group of people by improving traditional media as well. Because currently large viewer bases who continue to engage through traditional media have benefits accrued to them at the point at which this precise problems that the POI pointed out are addressed, because you now have an incentive to, for instance, portray women's sports, and also more importantly, to recognize market demands as they exist and recognize when like ESPN, for example, is being outcompeted, they're likely to change in a way that they didn't do on their side because there was no competition for them in the first place because of monopolization and lock-in contracts. Let's talk about opening opposition then. They say you have more attention on small clubs, and the reason they give you is because you have to buy all the coverage rights as a package. First off, framing at the top of this whip. Why, if it constrains their behavior in a way that's not profit maximizing, are they going to like actually show all of these coverage rights, even if they did have to buy them as a package, right? So it's an empirical claim, and then like a very dubious impact that I don't think is sufficiently mechanized, right? I think ultimately then on plausibility, we're able to beat opening opposition and prove that we are more inclusive of various groups, that we get the social progress that we so desperately needed, that all teams tried to reach. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. And with this, I would like to welcome the opposition whip to close up this really great debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible? Okay, wait. Okay, there's a cover in there. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Splendid. My gender pronoun is he, him. If you have any POI, please put it on the chat box and do not open your microphone. I'll prioritize from OG. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 issues in the speech. Firstly, which one is better for the player? Secondly, why government side reduce the entertainment purpose of the sport? And thirdly, which side, how government side of the house reduce the accessibility of the shows or game? Firstly, which one is better for the players? Because opening government rely their idea on the global sponsors and so on and so forth. Because we believe that it is not the debate. Because international TV coverage also, international TV exclusive deals also exist in our side of the house. For example, even if Premier League exists in the United Kingdom, doesn't mean that Indonesian TV cannot buy the licenses to that, and therefore global sponsors from Indonesia can go through that. But three additional responses towards them. One, we told you that barrier to entry or fame is not the debate, because there's a massive gridlock of this in the opening debate and to a certain extent closing government, right? Because serious POI is valid the moment they question the equal representation in opening opposition, and we believe that opening government's argument as to accessibility of like getting exposure and so on and so forth, we believe that is not valid, because in order for you to win in social media as well, you need high connection to the top teams or managers. For example, in the gaming community, in which you have to have connection with the Sentinels or Team Liquid, or for example, Messi won in social media because he already have a deep connection with Barcelona from the very first place, right? This is why we told you that is not the debate. We told you this is symmetrical because even traditional media also operates in a spectrum. This is the argument that closing government actually ignores, right? We told you that like huge channels such as ESPN might not want to show local fencing or volleyball, but random channel in Indonesia such as O Channel actually wants this. The structural reason to this is actually the exclusive deals that opening government actually analyzed. Why? Because the moment NBA already have exclusive deal with, for example, ESPN, that's the moment other television channel cannot actually air that, and being forced to air different kind of sports and different kind of things, and this is why exposure can exist for every single individuals. Therefore, accessibility is not the issue. This is why opening government's delta, that is what the ability to show up, is at best symmetrical in government's and like opposition side of the house. But second response is we believe that sponsors will be much more in opposition side of the house, because we are not talking about gaming, because gaming does not have the transition that we are talking about, because they start in social media from the very first place. The actual transition happens in the physical traditional sports, especially those who do not have as much attention, attention such as badminton or volleyball, for example. Television, what does television and traditional media give? Television gives the sport legitimacy as a real sport, and therefore incentivize sponsors to actually give money towards the team in itself, right? The reason, the structural reason for the legitimacy is because the moment you are being bought by a traditional media, that's the moment you are being accepted as legit by a
by a trustworthy institution that has been established for decades, for example. This is why it will ensure more sponsors in our side of the house. But why this will encourage sponsors? Two reasons. One, TV exclusive deal ensure constant viewership basis from the loyal viewer of the television in itself. This is why if sponsors are, for example, profit oriented, they might want to have the loyal viewer from the TV in itself. Therefore, more sponsors in our side of the house. But secondly, sponsors will feel more good about where the money actually go because they are sponsoring the actual respectable thing that has been legitimized by an actual institution, for example. This is especially important in niche sports that opening government wants to protect, such as Olympic fencing. This, even if, like for example, fencing have small social media coverage, it is still sponsored by Nike because of the legitimacy given by TV deals for Olympics, for example. This is why sponsors will be better in our side of the house, especially for the minority sport. But thirdly, what will happen in government is that they never analyze when traditional media do not air sport, what will happen then? What will happen is they will use the airtime for other things such as music, drama, or movies. But why this is bad then? This is bad because it will overcloud the airtime and fame for the athlete that government actually wants, right? Because we analyze to you that TV influence are still huge in status quo. Why is this true? Two reasons. One, the production budget that TV have is actually very big, especially coming from a big corporation, and therefore the quality of the TV content are actually comparatively better. But secondly, TV also have legacy, for example. They already have the loyal viewership or the perception of quality that has been built with the decades of their operation. Therefore these people already have better influence. This is why in TikTok or Instagram currently the content shows are actually clips from the TV, for example. This is why the moment the shows actually decline from traditional media, that's the moment the conversation about sports actually decline. Therefore, the money that the players actually have, the betterment for the athlete in government side is contingent on the conversation in the traditional media. But before going further, I'll take opening government.
My first response to opening opposition explains that mainstream media will adapt to compete with the rise of social media. CG both try to copy this claim, but also spend 5 minutes rebutting us. Can you please respond to that co-option of your benefit?
Literally read the motion, right? When the motion literally say at the expense means that the traditional media will probably not air the sports because they will choose to do other things because the sports are declining in the traditional media. Therefore, for example, the TV gets better and people go to TV, there is no at the expense of traditional media. Read the motion. But therefore, we told you that for the athletes that government wants to protect, we told you it's better in our side of the house. Second issue, why government side of the house reduce the entertainment purpose of the sport? We analyzed to you that diehard fans is the most important stakeholder in the debate. We don't care if we lose the gray area or the moderate sport fans, because we told you diehard fans give more money because 3 reasons. One, these are the people who is devoted enough to your club that they want to buy merch, secondly, these people buy the tickets, and thirdly, these people religiously follow the sport, the athlete, and so on and so forth. Therefore, these people's interest is to understand as deep as possible or watch the whole match. Therefore, when opening government told you that these people do not have the attention span, it is wrong, especially in the, for example, in the diehard fans. We believe that closing government completely loses the debate the moment they say that traditional media still exists, because the motion literally say at the expense. But what does at the expense mean? At the expense literally mean reducing funding, not buying licenses, or not making the deep analysis. Therefore, those content that they say still exist do not exist in the government side of the house. Therefore, they have a house stance and cannot win, right? But recognize, we trade off the moderate fans. We believe that this is fine because moderate fans is one, uncertain, they come and go depending on the trend. But secondly, they only view without monetization. We want to ensure the hard fans to keep still invested in the club and in the sports, because these are the people who makes money, and we have the principal responsibility to cater towards them that has contributed the most in our sport win.
Thank you so much for this great speech and this very wonderful debate. With this, I will take a couple of minutes to go over my notes and come with a call. I do not have a wing, so you don't need to leave this room. I will just disconnect my audio. So yeah, I'll come in 10 minutes or so.